say the entire decade of the 1990s was miserable for Maryland football would be an understatement. I mean, they did go to a bowl game in 1990 where they tied with Louisiana Tech, but outside of that, Maryland would then go on a decade bowl drought from 1991 to 2000 where they just were either mediocre at best or really bad. Despite having a quarterback like Scott Milanovic throwing the football, they just couldn't find that sustained success that they had had in the 1980s under Bobby Ross. But in 2001, a savior came to the program, that being Ralph Friedgen. And heading into 2001, expectations were obviously low for Maryland. A lot of them saw them between the 4 and 5 win mark, which I believe in 2000 they won 5 games, so it wouldn't have been unusual. But through the first 5 games of the season, Maryland was 5-0, and they were ranked in the top 25, and they had a big game coming up against Virginia Tech, who was ranked 15th in the nation. And this would basically make or break deciding on whether Maryland was the real deal or not at this point. And well, needless to say, they proved themselves.
2nd and 7, tight formation. They run, Burns, he lost the ball! Maryland wins! They recover the fumble, and the Terrapins are undefeated! 6-0!
They would win the next week against Duke to get to 7-0, which was the first time since 1978 that they had started 7-0 or better. They did have a mulligan the next week against Florida State, but Florida State was a really good team around this point in time, so it was no surprise there. But after finishing the regular season a shocking 10-1, Maryland was now playing in a big bowl game. How big was it? It was the FedEx Orange Bowl, which back then was basically one of those ones where only top 10 teams got into play, and Maryland was ranked number 10 in the rankings heading into this game. However, their opponent was the 5th ranked Florida Gators. They're still coached by Steve Spurrier and had a really good college quarterback in Rex Grossman and just overall great NFL talent. And even though the Terrapins fell in this game badly, 56-23, the future was bright for the Terps. I mean, sure, senior quarterback Sean Hill was graduating, so you weren't going to have him next year, but a young running back by the name of Bruce Perry came in and led the ACC with 1,242 rushing yards with 10 TDs, along with Marcus Riley, who on 85 carries had 10 touchdowns himself, as Maryland found themselves rushing for over 2,400 yards and 35 touchdowns. They also had an all-pro at linebacker, that being E.J. Henderson, who was just unstoppable. I mean, he could intercept the ball, he could sack the quarterback, all this stuff. I mean, he was an amazing, amazing athlete, so they still had their leader on defense. And heading into 2002, things were looking up for the Terps, and the expectations were even higher, but things got off to a rough start, to say the least. They would get shut out by Notre Dame in week 1. Their rebounding in week 2 would then lose to Florida State again in week 3, meaning that after starting 7-0 the year before, Maryland football was now off to a 1-2 start, and it was starting to look like 2001 was just a flash-in-the-pan season. But then they would win 8 of their last 9 regular season games to go to 10-3, and this time they were playing in the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl against another SEC foe, that being the Tennessee Volunteers, who were another SEC team around this time that was really, really good, although they were having a kind of a down year for their standards at 8-4. But nonetheless, it was another SEC team, and Maryland wanted to prove that they could hang with the big boys of the SEC, and well, they definitely proved that. Not only beating Tennessee, but beating the bricks off of them 30-3, as they just played defense very well, offense did enough to win the game, and the special teams improved, as this year the special teams was one of the big things for Maryland. Nick Novak, who went 16-25 kicking field goals in his freshman year in 2001, ended up going 24-28, leading the ACC in field goal attempts and field goals made, along with field goal percentage, and he kicked the most extra points at 54 and made 53, so needless to say, he was an ACC All-American. And then you have Brooks Bernard, who had the highest punt yard average in the ACC as well, so Maryland was able to win the field position game and let E.J. Henderson and their defense do its thing, while also having a really, really solid return game, as wide receiver Steve Suter was good in the kick return game, having 546 return yards on 22 returns, but in the punt return game, that's where he excelled. 56 returns, 771 yards, 4 touchdowns, averaging 14 yards a return, all led the ACC. And with an 11-3 record, Maryland was officially on the map. They were the real deal. But heading into 2003, sort of similar to 2002, Maryland Maryland got off to another slow start. They got upset by Northern Illinois in week 1, and then they would lose to Florida State in week 2, those pesky Seminoles. And Maryland was 0-2 this time around. But sort of similar to last season, they would win 9 of their last 10 games to go to 9-3 and would be in yet another bowl game, which was the Gator Bowl, where they would take on the West Virginia Mountaineers. And just like they did to those pesky Tennessee Vols, Maryland would come out on top 41-7. And in 3 years under Ralph Friedgen, the Terps had a record of 31-8. And they were 2-1 in bowl games. And these past 2 seasons, in 2002 and 2003, they had a quarterback by the name of Scott McBrien who came in, was just a pretty solid quarterback. He can run the ball a little bit. He was just very agile, and he was a big leader on this team, a strong arm, and he would finish as one of the best quarterbacks in Maryland history despite only being a 2-year starter. But now with him gone, the question was who was going to be quarterback heading into next year as well, because I believe Nick Novak was also set to be gone, so they had to move on from him. And this led to kind of the down years in the Ralph Friedgen era, as in 2004, Maryland would go 5-6. However, their highlight of this season was actually upsetting a top 10 ranked Florida State team.
For Florida State, maybe the game. Ricks again back, looking, a lot of room to run, but too far to go for a first down. Incomplete! Maryland takes over.
Aggression.
We're not done yet, though. It's just going to be handled by State. He's trying to run the clock down, and there he puts the knee down, but
I think he got it.
33 seconds and ticking. History is made today for Maryland. The first time they have ever beaten Florida State, and the number 5 Florida State Seminoles are going to be knocked off.
And then in 2005, again, Maryland would go 5-6 and miss out on a bowl. So all of a sudden, Maryland was kind of falling again. But then Q 2006, Sam Hollenbach was now the starter, and sort of similar to Scott McBrien, he never put up great stats. He was a solid quarterback. Maryland rode the run game with Lance Ball and Kenyon Lattimore, and they had a wide receiver by the name of Darius Hayward-Bay who was starting to make a name for himself. And just like that, through the first 10 games, Maryland was 8-2, ranked in the top 25 once again, and fighting for an ACC title. They would lose their last 2 regular season games to fall to 8-4, but they were back in a bowl game, and this time it was against a Big Ten team, that being the Purdue Boilermakers, where Maryland actually won this game 24-7, finishing 9-4, barely finishing outside of the top 25. But this season was weird for the Terps because when you look, they were 9-4, but they weren't necessarily dominating, as they scored 284 points while allowing 284 points. And before their 17-point win in the Champs Sports Bowl against Purdue, their largest win in the regular season was a 14-point win over Middle Tennessee State. Heck, even William and Mary, they only beat by 13 points. So it wasn't like Maryland was going out there and blowing the bricks off of their opponents. And there was only a couple of times where Maryland actually got blown out themselves. It was just Maryland winning a lot of close games, coming down to the wire and coming through in the clutch. That was just really showing the resilience that this Terps team had. Fast forward a year later to 2007, and Maryland was back in a bowl game again. However, they were just 6-6. But they did have 2 highlights this season, and that was 2 upsets of top 10 teams. As in week 5, Maryland would go on the road against 10th ranked Rutgers, because yes, there was a time where Rutgers football was really good, and they would beat the Scarlet Knights 34-24 with young quarterback Chris Turner getting the start there. And late in the season, on November 10th in week 10, they were hosting the 8th ranked Boston College Eagles, who, if you don't know at this time, were still fighting for a national title hope with Matt Ryan at quarterback. So this was no just slouch Boston College team. This was a really good team, and Maryland would go on to win this one 42-35, making it one of the few times Maryland has had 2 top 10 upsets in the season. After beating North Carolina State in the final week of the season 37-0 with one of the funniest penalty calls I've ever heard.
Personal foul, 69, offense. He was giving them the business. He played it down.
Maryland was able to go to 6-6 and become bowl eligible, and in the Emerald Bowl this time around, they would lose to Oregon State, scoring all 14 of their points in the first quarter before not being able to score again. So for the third time in 4 years under Friedgen, Maryland had a losing record, although this one was different because they actually made a bowl game, but, you know, it was just seemed to be another down year for the Terps. But in 2008, Maryland would respond again. They had an ugly win against Delaware in week 1, and then for whatever reason fell to Middle Tennessee State. Still don't know how that was possible. Maryland would have an interesting year after that, as not only would they have one win against a top 25 opponent, they would have 4 separate wins against teams ranked in the top 25, their most in a season, and it hasn't even been coming close to being matched, as after that loss to Middle Tennessee State, Maryland came back the very next week and beat number 23 California 35-27. A couple weeks later, they would go to Clemson and beat the Tigers, who were ranked 20th at the time, 20-17. Against 21st ranked Wake Forest in week 7, they would shut them out 26-0, a week after being shut out by Virginia. And then in a key late season matchup, the 17th ranked North Carolina Tar Heels were coming to Maryland to take on the Terrapins, and a late Obi Egekeza field goal, yes, remember him, he was very inconsistent for the Terrapins, would lead them to a 17-15 win, and sitting at 7-3, Maryland once again had a chance at an ACC title.
Egekeza, he's got it. Sexton fires deep. It is intercepted. And it's going to be a game winner for the Maryland Terrapins, whose dream for Tampa still exists.
After being absolutely obliterated by Florida State the following week, Maryland still had a chance to make the ACC championship game if they were to beat 20th ranked Boston College on the road. And although it was a close competitive game, Boston College came out on top, and at 7-5, Maryland was not playing for the ACC title. But they were back in a bowl game, and this time they were going to be playing in the Humanitarian Bowl, which nowadays is known as the Idaho Potato Bowl, and I hated watching this thing because, for those that don't know, Humanitarian/Idaho Potato Bowl is played in Boise, Idaho, home of the Boise State Broncos, which is played on blue turf. The Maryland Terrapins, led by a young Torrey Smith, are ready to enter the NFL draft. Darius Hayward-Bay and a young QB by the name of Chris Turner were ready to come in and make a statement, and they did. Sure, Nevada held in there too, led by a freshman quarterback by the name of Colin Kaepernick. Does that name sound familiar? It was able to be a back and forth game for the most part, but Maryland would win this one 42-35 and finishing the year out 8-5, and now they were 4-2 in bowl games under Ralph Friedgen. 2009 for the Terps would end up being one of the bigger outliers in the Ralph Friedgen era, because usually around this time, when you look at the 3 losing seasons they had with Friedgen before this year, they were one game under 500 every single year, and they made a bowl game in one of those seasons. But for whatever reason this year, the Terps just forgot how to play competitive football. Chris Turner was up and down. They didn't really have any good running play either. I mean, they did lose Darius Hayward-Bay in the draft, so that could have had a lot to do with it, but Maryland just was not a good team this year. I mean, they weren't necessarily bad to start the season off. They ended up going to California to start the year, who was ranked 12th, and after beating them the year before, California got their revenge by smoking Maryland. But what worried me was the next 2 weeks that followed, as Maryland would have their home opener against James Madison, and they would barely eke out a 38-35 win against the team, and the next week they were hosting Middle Tennessee State, and for whatever reason, in 2008 and 2009, Middle Tennessee State was just one of Maryland's bigger kryptonites, as Middle Tennessee State won this game by 1 point, and that's when I knew that this season wasn't going to go well. Sure, in week 5, they once again upset the Clemson Tigers 24-21, and at 2-3 weren't necessarily out of it, but Maryland would then go on a 7-game losing streak to finish out the season, where they had a couple of close calls, including a shootout with Wake Forest, and even almost upsetting the Florida State Seminoles in the second to last week of the season. So it wasn't like Maryland wasn't competitive in a lot of these games, they just weren't good enough to win. It was almost like the opposite opposite of the 2006 team. Like, if the 2006 team had lost a lot of those close games that they had won, we probably would have been looking at the same thing. But this team was just so unclutch, and it left people wondering, what was 2010 going to bring? Because that was not a great way to finish off the 2000s when you had such a successful era with Ralph Friedgen as coach. But as Ralph Friedgen did, he helped the Terps turn around. After beating Navy in Week 1 17-14, which they were actually playing that at M&T Bank Stadium, home of the Ravens, which, newsflash, senior receiver for the Terrapins would get drafted by the Ravens in the 2011 NFL Draft, Maryland decided to make a QB change because even though they won this game, their starting quarterback Jamar Robinson only went 2 for 5 passing with 11 yards and an interception. Now, it was no surprise that Navy didn't throw the ball because they're a team that runs the triple option, but considering Maryland only threw the ball 5 times, they realized that they can't have that. They can't be that team. Sure, they're a team that relies on the run, but it shouldn't have to rely that heavy on the run. And that brings us to the new guy in town, Danny O'Brien, which there's just something about having Bryan in your last name and being a Terps quarterback that just automatically makes you good and helps the team turn around, because Scotty McBrien was a good 2-year starter for the Terps in 2002 and 2003, and now we're bringing in Danny McBrien, who threw for over 2,400 yards with 22 touchdowns and 8 interceptions in 13 games this season, replacing Jamar Robinson, and he kept the Terps in it. Now, granted, they did have a good running back duo in Devon Meggett and Darrell Scott, and Torrey Smith would get past the 1,000-yard mark this year, and all of a sudden, the Maryland Terrapins went from 2-10 to 8-4 this year. Now, they didn't necessarily have a super tough schedule. They only played 2 ranked teams the whole year, losing to West Virginia early in the season, and then beating North Carolina State on the last regular season game of the year. But Maryland, once again, was competitive, and even at 2 points in the season, put up 62 points in a game, beating Morgan State 62-3, and later taking down ACC division foe Wake Forest 62-14. And at 8-4, Maryland was back in a bowl game and was ready to take revenge on whoever they were playing, and that team that they were playing was the East Carolina Pirates. And well, Maryland absolutely just obliterated them too, making them 5-2 in bowl games under Ralph Friedgen, where in 4 of those 5 wins, they absolutely weren't contests, and Maryland ran away with them. So, the future again was looking bright for the Terps, but something happened after this game that kind of shocked Maryland and even the college football world, because this was so unexpected, considering we just went from a 2-win season to a 9-win season, and Ralph Friedgen has brought this program to success. The Terps decided to part ways with Friedgen at the end of the year.
What are you doing?
And their reasoning for this was that they had a new athletic director in the building, and they were looking to do things differently that Friedgen didn't necessarily meet the standards to, as he thought that he wasn't necessarily a master at recruiting, and there was other things that were just going on. And considering the Maryland offensive coordinator had left at the end of the season, they were looking to just kind of start fresh with a new coaching staff, which still didn't make sense to this day. And that led to some dark times for the Maryland Terrapins, as they would hire Randy Edsall. He would be fired 6 games into the 2015 season, having been to 2 bowl games in 2013 and 2014, but losing both and having no more than 7 wins in a season. They would then have 2 years of DJ Durkin, who would then take them back to a bowl game in 2016, but like Randy Edsall did twice, Maryland would lose once again, and after going 4-8 in 2017, the Terps were looking for another new head coach. And by the way, at this point in time, starting in 2014, Maryland had moved to the Big Ten, so they were in a much tougher division, and they knew something had to give, but we still weren't there yet. 2018, they hire, oh good lord, Matt Canada as their head coach. Yes, the Matt Canada that Steelers fans wanted fired for just being a terrible offensive coordinator. They went 5-7 with Canada, and he actually was one and done as head coach. They literally just threw him to the side after that, leading to the Mike Locksley era, which started in 2019. Now, before the 2019 season, Mike Locksley actually had head coaching experience with the Terps, as when Randy Edsall was fired 6 games in the 2015 season, Locksley coached coached the final 6 games there and was 1-5 as the team's head coach. And they would go 3-9 in his first year, but that would basically be the worst of the Michael Locksley era, as next year was weird because it was a COVID season. Maryland only played 5 games. They did go 2-3 in those games, but they brought along a new quarterback with them by the name of Tualia Tagovailoa. That last name might sound familiar because he is the younger brother of Miami Dolphins quarterback Tua Tagovailoa. And Tualia, like his brother Tua, was recruited at Alabama and was supposed to be the successor to his brother, but when Nick Saban went with Mac Jones over him, decided to transfer to Maryland. Now, why did he choose Maryland? Well, Mike Locksley was a quarterbacks coach for Alabama when Tualia was recruited, so Tualia just wanted to go somewhere the coach he knew that he could get along with, and, well, it started to mesh. As starting in 2021, Maryland would get back to a bowl game, and in the Pinstripe Bowl, they would absolutely just mollywop Virginia Tech, and Maryland had their first winning record in 7 years. And then in 2022 and 2023, Maryland would have back-to-back 8-win seasons, which culminated in 2 more bowl victories, that being the Duke's Mayo Bowl against North Carolina State and the Music City Bowl, where they actually took care of business against an SEC team in Auburn. And the fun fact about that game was Tualia didn't even start. He was actually declaring for the NFL draft, so he was getting ready, meaning that Billy Edwards was coming in to start, and he had a great game, and it gave Maryland Terrapins fans hope that he would be the next guy. But after 3 straight winning seasons and 3 straight bowl appearances, Maryland then had to endure a kind of retooling season. They were 4-3 through 7 games in 2024, but they had quarterback issues. Billy Edwards was good, but couldn't stay healthy, and there was guys like MJ Morris and Cameron Edge who just weren't necessarily cutting it when they did play, and that led to Maryland going 4-8 during the 2024 season, and all 3 of the quarterbacks that started a game for the Terps that year all transferred out, meaning that Maryland needed to find a quarterback, and they needed to find one fast. So Mike Locksley decided to just stay in Maryland and do it. And now a Glenn Burney project by the name of Malik Washington, a 4-star QB recruit, is leading Maryland, and they already matched their win total from last year's. They are 4-0 as of the making of this video, and Malik Washington is off to one of the best starts of any Big Ten freshman quarterback, and he's also just the 2nd true freshman to start at quarterback from week 1 for Maryland, the other being Perry Hills in 2012. And it looks like with Malik Washington, the Terps are going to be in good hands for a while and could be a threat to be reckoned with, as we might be looking at Mike Locksley's Ralph Friedgen-esque peak as we speak. As for the Ralph Friedgen era, I find it highly underrated. Nobody talks about it enough unless you are a Maryland Terrapins fan, because after the 80s, things just weren't good for the Terps, and when Friedgen came in, they weren't just a good team, but they were a competitive team that was constantly fighting for division titles year in and year out, and would see themselves ranked in the top 25 more often than not. Sure, they had their down seasons, but it wasn't anything ever to worry about, and when they were able to figure it out, I mean, they figured it out, and Ralph Friedgen was just a savior to the program who got unceremoniously kicked because, well, new athletic director wanted to take charge immediately for whatever reason, and it led to about or pretty much a decade of failure for the Terrapins until recently. So would really like to hear in the comments below from other Maryland Terrapins fans, what were these Ralph Friedgen seasons like for you? I mean, obviously in 2001, it had to be an utter surprise how he just came in and boom, turn this program around, getting the team to the Orange Bowl, for God's sakes. But, you know, outside of that, what were some of his flaws that maybe, you know, you didn't agree with that kept you from, like, actually liking him? But also, what were some of the things you liked about Ralph Friedgen, and why do you think he was able to keep the Terps afloat for all those years, even during some of their worst moments? But until then, that is it for me. Stay safe out there, and I will catch you all in the next one.